So, hello, Francisco Bastitta. We are here for talking of your last book, which is entitled An Ontological Freedom, the Origins of the Notion in Gregory of Nyssa and its Influence into the Italian Renaissance. Perhaps you can show us the book. It has been published quite recently by Brill and Schöningh in 2023, and we will discuss it in this video. Francisco is assistant professor in the University of Buenos Aires and at the Catholic University of Argentina, and is researcher at the CONICET, the National Research Council of Argentina. This book is derived from his PhD defended in 2016, and perhaps one of the questions will be how he has reworked it from a PhD to this beautiful book. As the title indicates, it's a multifaceted study. It's divided into three parts. The first one, Gregory of Nyssa's conception of freedom and its medieval fate in the East and West, with already two chapters. The first one properly on Gregory of Nyssa's conception of freedom, and the next on the first posterity, medieval posterity of these texts and doctrine. We will go back to this point later. The second part is on the reception and translation of Gregory of Nyssa's text in the Italian 15th century, with a first chapter on the new translation into Latin in the 15th century, mainly in Italy, and another chapter which turns more to the books themselves and to the presence in public and private library in the Quattrocento. And the third part, which is also very original and fruitful, is about the philosophical influence of Nyssa's theory of freedom on the authors of the Quattrocento. First, on Nicholas of Cusa, and then on Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, so two major thinkers of the period. As it's already clear from this short outline of the text, we have almost three, perhaps four types of studies in this book. Work on Gregory of Nyssa himself, his thought on his work, then on the first translations and reception of Gregory, both in the East and in the West, in the medieval era. Then a new part on the new translations at the beginning of the Renaissance and first reception in Italy, and then an investigation into the thought of two main thinkers of the Quattrocento, Nicholas of Cusa and Giovanni Pico della Mirandola. So we have some patristic studies, some translation studies, some book studies, and then some philosophical studies and or theological studies on the Renaissance period. And it's this articulation which is very original. I mean, some of the topics have already been studied. As Francesco reminded at the beginning of the book, there have already been some studies on theology of freedom by Gregory. There has been, of course, studies on Giovanni Pico della Mirandola. There has been studies on the translations, but not exactly in this direction, and nobody has already tried to put all the pieces of the puzzle together in order, in particular, and for me, it's the main point in the book, to see how the intellectual filiation that we can reconstitute in Nicholas of Cusa and Giovanni Pico della Mirandola have support or not in the Greek and Latin books they have been able to see and to have into their hands. I mean, including some remarks on the marks left by Giovanni Pico della Mirandola in the books of Gregory have used with these peculiar reading marks indicating the precise sections he has studied and remarked, and for which Francesco finds traces later on in his own public on writing by Pico della Mirandola. So it's a very, very complete book. At the same time, of course, it's a book which is never finished, an inquiry which is never finished, because it's a very large topic. But in it, we have already some very clear answers on these diverse questions. So congratulations first. And then perhaps I have spoken enough to present it. We can now turn to your own reactions to some questions in order to go deeper inside the book itself. So how did your book project originate? It was a PhD, but how this idea of this complex inquiry into both the Renaissance authors and the filiation of Gregory has emerged in your mind?
Thank you, Matthieu. Thank you so much. I first want to tell you how happy I am and grateful I am that you are conducting this interview. A friend, a colleague who has helped me so much along the way in this book. So yes, I hear everything, and I thank you for that brief statement of the contents of the book and its origin. Yes, it began as a PhD thesis in the University of Buenos Aires, where I work as an assistant professor, and it's very vast. The topic is so vast. So I had been working for some years with Gregory of Nyssa's anthropology, and I had found certain aspects of it, particularly the interpretation of the human image of God, the image of God and humanity, particularly striking and radical with respect to the previous tradition, both the pagan tradition of homoiosis theo, similarity of God, and the soul as a spark of God, etc., and also the Judeo-Christian tradition of Philo and the Church Fathers and the Christian authors of late antiquity. Gregory's position was more radical in the sense that he saw a kind of indeterminacy of human nature reflecting the infiniteness of the divine. And that struck deeply into his conception of freedom, which was not only dynamic as Clement's or Origen's had been, or even Plato's conception of freedom had been, but was also constitutively self-creative and from the beginning, not just as the consequence of the fall or something like that. So it was really something interesting inside Gregory's anthropology, and I saw many resemblances with the authors of the Renaissance, particularly with two of them who were very dear to me, but I had not related to Gregory until then, which were Giovanni Pico della Mirandola and Nicholas of Cusa, which ended up being the authors that more clearly attest to the influence of and the reception of the text by Gregory. The medieval texts, which would traverse the medieval centuries, and the new texts that were translated for the first time or circulated in manuscript, in Greek manuscripts during the 15th century. So there were many scholars who had mentioned this similarity, none other than Eugenio Garen, between the Renaissance, the great Renaissance scholars, or Charles Trinkhaus, another great scholar who studied the reception of the conceptions of human image, the image of God and humanity in the Renaissance. And Henri de Lubac, among the French scholars, also had dedicated a very beautiful essay on Pico's patristic sources in general. And there he places Gregory in an important role. But nevertheless, without digging into the possible evidence of contact, except de Lubac, who mentions that some of Gregory's manuscripts were in Pico's library. This, of course, had been already studied, and the catalogs had been edited also. No? But I was fascinated with that possibility. So coming from a pretty traditional, more systematic philosophical training, I was fascinated now with history of concepts and with history of texts, and trying to bring those together. So that was more or less the origin of my PhD and of course of the book. No?
Thank you. Yes, what is fascinating when reading you is that you constantly move from the books, the readings of the Renaissance men, and their writings, and you say you are starting from a philosophical background, but you have turned really perfectly into the books themselves, into the history of books and texts. And yeah, perhaps you can tell a word about that point. How do you articulate in your own work? Because in your writing, it's perfectly clear. I mean, you have settled the foundations before, and then you turn to the interpretation of text. When you work preparing this PhD and then this book, how do you articulate these two dimensions of working on the books, on the translations, and on the ideas?
Well, I must say it was very tough, especially at the beginning, because I was dealing with the new disciplines and with very little material to work on. So I tried to set the most important points that I wanted to dig into, especially, for example, I couldn't dig into all the textual reception of Gregory of Nyssa in Italy during the 15th century. That would have been another PhD and nothing to do with this. So I had to select, for example, the main cities where the scholars had shown interest in these authors and had a philosophical interest in them, because there were all kinds of scholars dealing with this text. So I selected some of the cities, Rome, for example, or Florence, which were very strong intellectual centers of philosophical training and philosophical interest and reception of Platonic texts, for example. And in the second level, maybe also Venice and Urbino and other important centers of circulation of new manuscripts and arrival of the Byzantine erudites and scholars. So I try to have a general picture, but chose to dig into some of these centers that, of course, had contact with the philosophers I was interested in to study. But well, Pico was around, and Nicholas of Cusa too. He actually was in Byzantium in a mission, the papal mission, or mission of the Council of Basel, and so they were very protagonists of the intellectual movements of their day. So that was that was very tough, and actually it was a very powerful learning experience to try and make a dialogue between the philosophical ideas and their material support in the texts. And actually, I think some of the fruits of the research have to do with that particular aspect, to find the relationships between the conceptions of the philosophical conceptions of both authors, evidenced in the material support, no, of the texts. So it's it's been very, very tough, but also a great learning experience. No?
Yeah, for future readers of the book, and I hope there will be many, perhaps we can remind that, in fact, you mainly focus on De Hominis Opificio and the question, as you have already told, of Imago Dei and of Genesis 1:26 is one of the turning point of your research, but you do not limit yourself to these two. Perhaps you have already spoken a bit about that, but could you summarize some most significant findings of this research, turning back now to what you have written or not written? What would be the main acquisitions?
Okay, thank you. Well, I would say that some of the significant findings had to do with, first, an unexpected one was to find the vast influence of Gregory's anthropology all through the Middle Ages, and of course not only in the Latin world but also in Byzantium. In many ways, this is a difficult topic because Gregory was not such a respected authority. He was not even very well known in the West, for example. And he was shadowed by the figure of his elder brother. And he was also associated to, in many ways, to Origen and Origenism. So his figure was not all that clear and immaculate, neither in the East, no, in Byzantium. So nevertheless, his influence is profound at a kind of subterranean level, you know, and it's easy to miss it when you make a rapid analysis of authors and texts in the medieval period. But I had to do that, and it was unexpected because I couldn't jump from the 4th century to the 15th. So many of the texts that were circulating in the 15th century were produced in the Middle Ages, almost all of them. Huh? And the translations of the Hominis Opificio were made in the 6th and 9th centuries by two eminent scholars like Dionysius Exiguus and Eriugena. So through Eriugena, who quotes a quarter part of his own translation of the Opificio Hominis into his great opus, his Periphicion, the influence of Gregory was pervasive, and his anthropology particularly, because that's, of course, the topic of the Opificio Hominis. So that was an indirect influence, which was very powerful in the Renaissance. And of course, the most important figure here would be Nicholas of Cusa, who is actually receiving that anthropology from many of his sources indirectly. And there is a possibility that he read Gregory directly, but we cannot be sure. So he did read the Periphicion, both in Eriugena's version and in the abridged version of the Clavis Physicae. So he received Gregory's anthropology through several sources. But and the other significant finding has to do, of course, with the new translations of Gregory, which of course have been studied, and there's some interesting studies about them, but not as a whole movement of rediscovery of his work. And also many eminent scholars of the 15th century, as George of Trebizond and Athanasius Chalciopoulus and and other eminent scholars made their new versions, and they circulated around, and some of them were known to Pico, for example. We don't know about Nicholas of Cusa. And so that was very significant, because what I propose is that Pico had a more deep knowledge of Gregory's oeuvre, and particularly of some other treatises that are more daring in their affirmations of human self-creativity, for example, and even ontological freedom, and even the possibility of being whatever we desire or decide to be. And that is a typical trait of Gregory's anthropology that has no proper parallel in, for example, the Neoplatonic sources or other Christian sources, and that radical formulation.
Yeah, I must say that first reaction when you see such a title and such a type of inquiry you propose, okay, but how can it trace his back from Pico to Gregory? Okay, Gregory has been received by so many canals and so many intermediaries. How can it trace back? And yeah, starting your demonstration by the translations, and we can remind future readers that you have published the translation of Athanasius Kalkeopoulos of the homilies on the Lord's Prayer in the last conference volume of the Gregory of Nyssa's conference, and it's a great achievement too, with a colleague. And so, starting from the translations, from the manuscripts themselves, you were reminding that for Nicholas of Cusa, we do not need exactly what he may have been able to read from Gregory directly, but you trace back to a manuscript now in Oxford, and it reminds me some previous studies by myself on these manuscripts for other topics, but we have traces of reading in these manuscripts by Nicholas of Cusa, but when he was young, when he was in Constantinople, so not precisely in relation to the works you're investigating later. And so this slowly, step by step, you just build the edifice that will convince your reader later on. So yeah, congratulations again. And
thank you.
I mean, when you look back to the book, how it's now, what gap do you think is just building upon? Gaps in scholarships, and what are the doors that are still wide open, or that you just find opening when writing the book?
Thank you. You're speaking of two kinds of gaps,
yeah.
aren't you?
Behind you and in front of you.
Yes. Well, I don't really know if it fills a gap, any significant gaps in history. I really hope that it offers a case of mutual benefit between different disciplines, between history of philosophy, history, intellectual history proper, or philology, including, of course, paleography, codicology, history of books, as you mentioned. I think this has been this could be a debt of our scholarly tradition. Of course, there are many excellent studies that try to combine these two aspects. But I think we must always work in this interdisciplinary spirit, not just one scholar trying to build bridges into the other disciplines, but we should work together, not only in very general projects, but specifically trying to study a topic I learned that from this case. I don't know if it's the greatest example of that, but I think it's a pretty good case that it's fruitful to engage and to make an interplay between these disciplines, because there's the discussion between Rezeptionsgeschichte and Wirkungsgeschichte, that they're not exactly the same, the reception of text and the impact of ideas, but you cannot see those independently. Of course, they must be studied together, and the modes of reception are fundamental to understand the transmission of knowledge and ideas. So I hope it's an example of that, or at least a case of that.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, when you just have a look at Gregory of Nyssa's dictionary, which has been prepared some years ago now by Father Matthieu Cassin and Giulio Maspero, reception of Gregory is almost absent of it, not because the dictionary is bad, but because there were almost nothing, or at least nothing synthetic on it. And I have worked a bit on this topic on the Eastern side recently, and you just need to go to the text and to the edition and to look for. And when I have read your chapter on the medieval Latin reception, I mean, we just discover many things and putting them together. And what you have told also about those milieu of reception in Renaissance, and this kind of informal network of translators and philosophers and scholars interested in Gregory is very interesting, because of course we have already studies on such translation of Gregory, or on translations by, say, George of Trebizond, but not of translation of a father among such network, and it's a great gain of your book. And perhaps to look forward now, is there some topics, some questions which open for you having finished the book?
Yes, there are many, and I think that maybe a positive aspect of these kinds of studies is, I think, that the amount of doors that are left ajar, and that we don't even have the opportunity of seeing what's beyond. And as you mentioned in the last question, but I think it encourages us in a way to keep exploring. For example, these two areas of studies of late antiquity and early Christian studies and Renaissance studies, they have been connected in some very important studies, but not that much. There's so much happening there. The Renaissance is not only the recovery of pagan antiquity, but it's also, and in many cases, primarily, the recovery of the synthesis of ancient thought and Christianity or Judaism in late antiquity. So it's they are very similar periods in many ways because of the political, cultural, religious transformations they have. So it's really fascinating to study them connectedly, and of course including or have the connections with the medieval centuries that are also fascinating in their mutual relationships. But and these two periods in particular, I think that are especially appealing because in many ways they resemble our own, because our own period is also a period of insecurity and social and cultural and even religious transformations that we don't really know where they'll end up. So it's not a period of stability as many of the intermediate periods were, but it's a period of transformation, a period of entering into something that the authors of the period do not really know, cannot really foresee. So it's I think that they share many of these, and of course, many great scholars, especially in philology, like Maria Rosa Cortesio, Sebastiano Gentile, or even Charles Stinger from intellectual history, have tried to bridge this gap and to express and deepen the relationship between these periods. But I think the door is still open, and I hope there'll be many more studies and research on these topics.
Yeah, you mentioned Maria Rosa Cortesi and Sebastiano Gentile, and I cannot hinder to think about some great conferences and books issued from conferences precisely on the topic of patristic reception in Renaissance Italy, starting from the books themselves and from the translations. But generally, this type of inquiry stop before entering into the thought of Renaissance men, and it's a point which is very important in your book. And so, may I ask you, who do you think is the main readers of your books? Have you written it for patristic scholars mainly, for Renaissance scholars, for both? Or because, yeah, it's a real need, I mean, for patristic studies to get in dialogue with later period and specialists of later period. But have you, when you write your book, a potential reader in mind or not?
Well, actually, maybe it's not that conscient, but
retrospectively conscient, perhaps.
Yes, exactly. I think I'm appealing to different kinds of readers in patristics or early Christianity or late antiquity in general, and readers in Renaissance, of course. But I think since I am inviting to study historically, to study ideas and text historically, I'm trying to bring them together in a way, and to awaken the interest in these historical connections that are both theoretical and textual. And there are really many excellent studies I come to my mind about these developments of ideas and concepts and text, and but I think much more are coming. There are many young scholars of patristics, of the Renaissance, of medieval studies, of ancient studies, and they are, I think, more and more interested in all the tools that are becoming available to everyone, and the international connections that permit us to work together and to study together in the same topic or several topics. So I think it's written for the intellectual community in general, especially those dedicated to history, of course, but historical disciplines. But I don't think in scholars of one period or students of one period exclusively. And of course, it tries to be accessible for students there who are our future, of course. But thank you for your questions, Matthieu.
Yeah, no, it's. I must say you are very clear indeed. Even, I mean, I'm not a specialist of the Renaissance, and you give all the indications for understanding you at every point of your demonstration. So, also for mainly patristic scholars, you just do not get back saying, okay, it's about Renaissance and reception. No, you need to go there. And I think you're right. It's it's an occasion to foster collaborations and dialogues between specialists of different periods and way of working on text and intellectual history. Have you a last word about the book and about your future research, perhaps, too?
Okay. Well, I could tell something. Well, actually, I'm going to follow this path. Whether I'm in a project studying a more Renaissance or late medieval subject, or an early Christian or late antiquity subject, I try to keep my mind in the connections. No? For example, the Renaissance, I keep an eye on the sources always, and the sources available, and the connections. And when I'm studying a topic in early Christianity, on late antiquity, pagan, Christian, Jewish, I also look at the connections and the fortuna that topic will have in the immediate or the distant future. So I try to keep open. Now I'm studying several topics that have little to do with the topic of the book, but the connections can be made, and the learning experience of the book will follow me around, you know. So it's been a great experience to study that topic.
Okay, so thank you so much, Francisco, and I just invite all persons to read the book. I'm a specialist of Gregory of Nyssa, of course, but also specialist of patristic studies, because it opens many perspectives of research and of thought for oneself. Also specialist of the Renaissance, but I think that they will be unable to get past the book without opening it. I hope so. So thank you again, Francisco, and congratulations for this wonderful book.